When my grandmother was born in rural Zimbabwe in 1928, Gogo's life script had already been written. You are a girl. You will marry. You will raise children. You will follow tradition. And the script, it ran. She married young. She bore him 11 children, 8 girls and 3 boys. You could say she understood the assignment. But then my grandfather died. A man whose life goal was to educate all of his children, especially the girls. And when he died, a dream died with him. Tradition dictated that my grandmother should now marry one of his 5 brothers. But if she did that, the girls would get married off, books would be closed, and the futures dimmed. So what do you do? What do you do when you're a young widow in a patriarchal code where you want to rewrite the future, but you have no stake at leadership? Well, my grandmother, she exercised leadership. She led. And it is because she led that I have the privilege of standing here today. I teach leadership at Harvard University. For over a decade, I have taught master's students, CEOs, community organizers, and even world leaders. A former student of the course myself, I now teach alongside Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who pioneered the ideas behind adaptive leadership. The simple premise at the center of this idea is that in this world, there are mainly 2 kinds of challenges, although of course they exist on a spectrum. But generally, there are technical problems, problems for which we have known expertise and which we can resolve with knowledge. On the other hand, are these adaptive challenges. And they're quite different in that the work that's required to make progress on an adaptive challenge tends to involve us living, sometimes learning, sometimes unlearning our way to a new future. The work that's required to do these challenges often lives in here and also in here. And when the work is in the head and in the heart, the approach that you need to make progress on that kind of challenge tends to be different. The biggest threat to adaptive challenges, treating them like they're technical, applying more force, more structure, more instructions. What you really need to understand is that the reason that it's difficult to make progress on these adaptive challenges is because they're deeply human. And human beings don't avoid change. What human beings avoid is loss. And my grandmother understood this. So she didn't storm the gates. What she did was she approached these brothers as men who were afraid of loss, afraid of losing identity, afraid of losing power, position, tradition, in the same way that she too was afraid. So what did she do? Well, she cooked, she listened, she debated, she built alliances. She did the emotional and political groundwork that was necessary to create space for her to be able to do the work with this community that only they could do. And when the day arrived, the 5 brothers arrived, each holding a bowl of water. Tradition is that they present the water to the young widow, and whichever bowl she washes her hand in, that is the man that she will marry. She took the water, held it steady, paused a beat, and then she handed the water back. And she said, "This is not my water to carry." And what followed wasn't anger, what followed wasn't applause, but what followed was space. Space opened for debate, for discussion, for friction, for the community to do the work that only they could do. And my grandmother held that space. She watched, she pivoted, she paused, but she did not let fear get in the way. And she held that space as the community did the work that only they could do. That is adaptive leadership. But the work wasn't just out there, because of course there was a system that she was trying to change, but the system was also inside her. One way to think about this is that when she was born, when all of us were born, we come into this world as a vessel, an open vessel that is ready for programming, ready to take in the code. And in many communities and many traditions around the world, the first question that they ask when a baby is born is it a boy or is it a girl? And within seconds, they're already uploading that code. If this, then that. If this, then that. If girl, then. If speaking to elder, then. If in trouble, then. And few of us stop to try to understand what actually is going on here. Because what we don't realize is that this code is a pattern, is behaviors, instructions that we've internalized, that we have performed, been rewarded for, and repeated 1,000,000 times by the time that we're 8 years old. And even if we do see it, changing that code is incredibly challenging. Because my grandmother, she wanted to belong. She wanted a seat at the village fire. She wanted to sit amongst her peers at church. She wanted to be a part of this community. But questioning that code and trying to renegotiate that code means that you're renegotiating loyalties, you're renegotiating relationships, you're renegotiating tradition. And what's more, she was asking other people to do exactly the same thing, asking them to renegotiate loyalties to the living and sometimes to the expectations of the dead. But here's the thing. If we want a future that's different to the past that they had, if we're trying to create something new in the present, then the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So, change, leadership, transformation is not about keeping things the way that they were. So what are 5 lessons from my grandmother's story? And as I go through this, think about some of the challenges that you're grappling with and see how much of this might help. But the first thing is, get the diagnosis right. Because if you are treating an adaptive challenge like a technical problem, then you're not going to be able to make the progress that you want to make. And if you're trying to take people across a divide and you're finding that you're stuck, then think about it. What are some of the values? What are some of the loyalties? What are some of the relationships that you're asking people to risk? And how would your approach change if you also took that into account? The second lesson is that change is slow. It is layered, it is political, it is emotional, and it just takes time. Stick with it, especially when things start to stall. Lesson number 3, heat is part of the job. When you are challenging people's beliefs, when you are holding people in a difficult process of learning and unlearning, heat is a byproduct of that work. So don't shy away from the heat. Walk through the fire with them and create the space that they need to do the work that only they can do. Because that time just hasn't come when we can open people's heads or people's hearts and put in a chip. So that work is just work that needs to be done. Walk with them in the fire. Number 4, no title required. Formal authority has nothing to do with leadership. Leadership is the work of mobilizing people to do difficult work. And to do that kind of work, you don't need a fancy title. You just need to be willing to step into the work and to show people the work that they need to do. And then finally, check your code. Because if you don't know what's running you, then you can't lead. Because if you're just a creature of the system, then you can't lead that system. And these 5 lessons, they turn up everywhere. About 9 years ago, an alum of Harvard reached out to Ron Heifetz and myself. His name is Lyndon Morrison, and he leads one of the big divisions of the Global Fund, one of the big funders in global health around the world. And he had run into a problem. For about 10 years, they'd been working with a particular country, and that country had made incredible progress in the fight against HIV. The medicine was right, the science was right, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in trying to drive down HIV infection rates. But when they disaggregated the data and they took a closer look, they realized that for one subcategory in particular, adolescent girls and young women, the numbers were going up instead of going down. And if they couldn't figure this out, then all the work that they had been doing over an incredibly long period of time would begin to unravel, because this is obviously the most vulnerable group. And of course, behind every statistic, behind every piece of data, was a girl like Ruth, bright-eyed, ambitious, and ready to take on the world, even as the system was letting her down. Thousands of girls who were dreaming about a different future. The system was failing them, not because it wasn't trying hard enough, not because people didn't care, but it was failing them because people were treating it like it was a technical glitch, whereas in fact, it was human. And you might have seen this, but like with most human systems in trouble, people started pointing fingers. The parents pointed at the teachers pointed at the bar owners pointed at the police, and in the end, everybody pointed the finger at the girl. But of course, Ruth is not the problem. Ruth was just showing us the problem. She was pointing us in the direction of her mother, who didn't know how to have a conversation with her child about HIV or AIDS or sex. I mean, how did your mother teach you about sex? Ruth was pointing us to the fathers who weren't having conversations with their son, because the boys, they were invisible, rarely discussed. The men, absent from the solution, very present in the problem. Ruth was pointing us to the police officers who couldn't bring themselves to enforce the law against their neighbors for the sake of keeping their own status in the community, and to the doctors who couldn't give out life-saving drugs because of their own moral dilemma. She was pointing us to the problem. So what did we do? Well, we did what Gogo did. We opened space. We pulled in the parents, the adolescents, the chiefs, the pastors. We pulled in the bar owners, and we started a conversation. Not to point fingers, but to start a conversation with questions, with stories, with honesty. And in that work, we were able to help this community rise up onto the balcony and start to recognize the patterns, the relationships, the roles that were colluding to present in the very situation that they were trying to avoid, the ways in which they were stuck in the system that they were in. And slowly, the system started to evolve. Parents started to find ways to talk to their children, mothers to their daughters, and if they couldn't find words for their own daughters, then to the children of other parents. Fathers started talking to their sons about what it means to be a good man. Teachers helped each other to figure out how to have those difficult conversations in the classroom. Treatment rates started to go up, infection rates started to go down, and change started to happen. These communities started to recode their own wiring. They started to think about what does it mean for us to change the ways in which we interact, the conversations that are taboo, and how it is that we make progress. It is not easy work. It is courageous work. And they did that work because they did not want their communities to become yet another museum piece sitting behind tempered glass. But this kind of courage, it travels. I have seen this kind of courage working with military organizations in Western democracies completely on the other side of the world, where people in the military, senior commanders, are starting to grapple with the fact that technology is changing the shape of the battlefield. Geopolitical shifts are changing the nature of the work. And what that means is that quite often the soldier on the battlefield understands better what to do next than the person who sent them into that field. So in that context, senior leaders are grappling with what does it mean to lead? Junior officers are grappling with what does it mean to speak up, even when it feels risky? And then, around the world, in a completely separate context, sitting in Boston, Massachusetts, talking to another military commander from another organization, he turns to me and says, you know what, Professor Chipungu, what you've got me thinking about is, I don't know if I know how to lead. I'm very good at giving orders when I know the answer. But what does it look like to lead when I don't have the answers? I don't know if I know how to develop soldiers who are able to speak up and to be able to contribute and to be able to push back on me when they know better than I do what needs to happen next. I don't know if I know how to create that kind of an environment. So what's the work at the top? The work at the top is trying to think about how do I create a learning organization, not a relationship full of people who are dependent on you for the answer. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that we throw out command and control. I'm not saying that in any of your organizational or your family or community DNAs, there's nothing there worth keeping. What I'm saying is 99% of what you do now will continue to be valuable. The question is, how do you identify that small percentage of situations that require you to take another look at the playbook? Because the playbook of yesterday is not necessarily going to help us solve tomorrow's problems. So Ruth and her peers, these commanders, what I'm asking you to think about is, how do you sift through what do I keep, what do I let go of, and where must I innovate to bring about a different future? And we use the term adaptive because we borrow from nature, who in her time has managed a lot of change. Because when nature has a caterpillar and she wants to turn it into a butterfly, she asks those same three questions. What do I keep? What do I let go of? And where do I need to innovate? Thank you.